Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the hidden facts about Markarth, the waterfall-carved city of stone and silver, built into the bones of a vanished civilization out in the wild western reach of Skyrim. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. The Cradle of Stone. Long before the Nords ever set foot in the valley of the Karth River, the Dwemer built their home there in the early First Era. They named it Nchuanzel, which meant Radiant City in their tongue, a name that feels almost poetic for a civilization otherwise remembered for its cold logic and mechanical precision. It was carved into the roots of a mountain called Karthmad, and the Dwemer built both downward into darkness and upward into daylight, a rare choice among their underground kingdoms. Most dwarven cities existed entirely below the surface, hidden from sun and sky, content to let their machines hum in perpetual shadow. Nchuanzel broke that pattern, rising in fortified towers and storehouses above the peaks, even as its deepest chambers plunged into the mountain's heart, a city that belonged equally to two worlds, one lit by torchlight and one lit by the sun. Even now, standing in modern Markarth and looking up at the jagged silhouette of the mountain above, it's worth remembering that everything visible today, every wall, every stairway, every waterfall channeled through carved stone, began as a single ambitious idea inside the mind of a civilization that no longer exists to take credit for it. Above the Karth, the very name Markarth carries its own quiet poetry, one that has survived every conqueror who ever tried to make the city theirs. In the language of the Reach, it translates to above the Karth, a simple description of a city perched over the river that still cuts through its heart today, its waterfalls tumbling past windows and stairways carved directly into the cliff face. Locals in ages past called it Markarth, and the name stuck through centuries of conquest, rebellion, and renaming attempts by whichever power happened to be holding the city that particular season. Even the Nords, who reshaped so much of the Reach in their own image and rewrote so much of its history in their own favor, never bothered changing what the land itself had already decided to call this place. The architecture of a dying race. Nchuanzel was constructed in a distinctive Dwemer building style known as Hogan Kultura, a design language of interlocking geometric halls, spiraling stairwells, and load-bearing pillars carved to resemble roots and branches of stone, reaching endlessly downward. This style shows up nowhere else in quite the same density as it does beneath Markarth, giving the ruins underneath the city a coherence that other scattered Dwemer sites across Skyrim simply lack, as though one singular architectural mind shaped every corridor. Scholars who have studied the architecture note that the builders seem to design with centuries of use in mind, layering redundant supports and secondary passages as though they expected the mountain itself to eventually try to reclaim what they had carved from it, patiently, one collapsed tunnel at a time. Storehouses against the sky. Nchuanzel earned a reputation among Dwemer settlements for something most of its sister cities lacked entirely: formidable above-ground defenses and enormous storage halls built to withstand siege and scarcity alike. While cities like the deeper settlements of Blackreach relied on total isolation for their safety, tucked far beyond any surface army's reach, Nchuanzel's builders assumed, correctly as it turned out, that armies would eventually come looking for them from above rather than below. Those storehouses proved so sturdy that centuries after the Dwemer vanished without a trace, human settlers found them still standing, still weatherproof, and still worth fighting over. A gift left behind by a civilization that never intended to give anything away. A debt written in 2 tongues. Long before the farmer became the twisted, blind creatures we know wandering the deep places of Skyrim today. They were the Snow Elves, a proud and once beautiful people, driven from the surface by the wars of the ancient Nords. When they came seeking refuge from that ancient slaughter, it was the Dwemer of Nchuanzel who took them in, offering shelter where the surface world offered only violence. But refuge came with a price, as it so often does in the Reach. The clans struck a bargain with the desperate Snow Elves, one that would blind them and bind them into permanent servitude in exchange for safety. This agreement was carved into stone in both the Dwemer and Falmer languages, a contract of subjugation literally written into the mountain itself, and that very slab still exists somewhere beneath modern Markarth, waiting for anyone patient enough and brave enough to translate it fully. Generations later, a certain court wizard obsessed with all things Dwemer would spend most of his career chasing exactly that translation, never quite realizing how personal and how painful the story carved into that stone truly was for the creatures he studied only from a comfortable, scholarly distance. The tree that should not be there. In one quarter of ancient Nchuanzel, where 2 prominent Dwemer families once made their homes side by side, explorers have found something deeply strange nestled between the stone dwellings. A tree growing outside where no tree has any business surviving at all. Its origins trace back to the region around what is now Whiterun, hundreds of miles from the mountain valley where it somehow took root and thrived in total darkness. No text explains how it got there, why the notoriously practical Dwemer allowed it to remain standing among their machinery, or what it might have symbolized to a race famously indifferent to organic, living things. It stands today as one of the quietest, strangest mysteries buried beneath the city of stone, a single patient witness to thousands of years of history it can never speak of. The sack of Nchuanzel. Nchuanzel did not escape the turbulence of the First Era unscathed, despite its formidable defenses. During the campaigns of High King Gelir, the city was sacked along with many other Dwemer strongholds scattered across Skyrim, its ancient walls breached by human ambition for the first time in its long history. Later, the Direni loyalist Ryain Direni conquered it again during the sweeping religious and political upheaval known as the Alessian Reforms, adding yet another layer of conquest to a city already well acquainted with the taste of siege. Each of these conquests chipped away at the city's independence and strength, softening it for what came next, though the Dwemer themselves would not disappear from the mountain, or from all of Nirn, for some time yet. The Great Disappearance. In the year 1 E700, an event occurred that still baffles scholars across Tamriel to this very day. The entire Dwemer race vanished from existence, all at once, everywhere, with no bodies left behind and no clear explanation beyond a botched or triumphant attempt to seize the power of a fallen god through an artifact called Numidium. Nchuanzel emptied out along with every other Dwemer settlement in the world, its lamps still lit, its automatons still standing sentinel over empty halls, its storerooms, its automated guardians, all of it simply continued existing with no one left to maintain, command, or explain them. A ghost city waiting patiently for new inhabitants who would not fully understand what they had inherited, or how dangerous some of it still was. Even in the present day, deep sections of that same ruin remain sealed off or heavily guarded, not out of tradition but out of simple necessity, since certain automated defenses built thousands of years ago apparently never received word that their makers were gone, and their war, whatever it was, had ended long ago. Shelter in the bones of giants. The native Reachman tribes did not take long to notice the enormous, defensible, and conveniently empty stronghold sitting abandoned in the heart of their homeland. In the years following the Dwemer's disappearance, these tribes began sheltering within Inchuanzel's confines during times of seasonal hardship, using its ancient halls the way one might use a cave for a hard winter, practical shelter first, permanent home later. It was a slow courtship between a people and a place, born out of necessity rather than conquest. Blankets and campfires spread across floors, once walked by beings who never once needed either. This quiet arrangement marked the beginning of a relationship between Reachman and the mountain that would eventually define both of their fates. The birth of Markarth. By the year 1 E930, what had started as seasonal shelter had grown into something far more permanent and settled. The Reachmen, who called the old Dwemer ruin home, developed a fully active, year-round settlement, and they gave it the name that would eventually become Markarth, spoken first around cookfires, long before it ever appeared on any map drawn by outsiders. The strongest chieftain who ruled over this new community held a title known in the Reach tongue as the Ard, translated simply as King of the Fort. It marked the true beginning of Markarth as a human settlement, built entirely on the bones of a civilization that no longer existed to object to its new tenants. The dismal posting, when the Alessian Empire eventually extended its reach over the valley, Markarth became an imperial holding, though not a particularly desirable one for anyone assigned there. Historical accounts describe the posting as dismal and dangerous for the imperial soldiers stationed within its walls, a garrison assignment nobody back in Cyrodiil ever wanted to receive. The isolation, the punishing mountain terrain, and the quiet, simmering resentment of the local population all combined to make Markarth feel less like a prize worth defending and more like a punishment worth avoiding. A pattern of imperial discomfort that would echo through the city's history for thousands of years to come. Human hands on dwarven stone. During the long stretch of imperial control, the city slowly transformed under human hands, though never entirely into a human place. Many of the old dwarven storerooms, originally built to hold grain and supplies for a vanished race, were converted into halls, houses and workshops for their new occupants, softened by torchlight and human clutter, where cold Dwemer precision once ruled. This period gave Markarth much of the layered appearance it retains even now. Human construction nested awkwardly inside older Dwemer bones. And yet, for all the renovation, one truth remained stubbornly unchanged across every generation that tried. No human skill, no matter how gifted the mason, could ever improve upon the walls and watchtowers the dwarves had built centuries before. A city forgotten by empire. When the Akaviri potentates fell and imperial authority began to collapse across Skyrim, Markarth slipped quietly back into obscurity, exactly the kind of forgetting the Reach had always seemed to invite. The Reach had never truly embraced outside rule, and once the Empire's grip loosened, the region reverted to what it had always secretly remained underneath the surface polish. A place outsiders rarely dared to travel, without good reason and better protection. Trade dried up to a trickle. Communication with the rest of Tamriel thinned to almost nothing. And in that darkness and isolation, new legends began to grow, unwatched and unrecorded by anyone outside the valley. Legends that would eventually shape the entire identity of the Reachmen people for centuries afterward. the child named for blood. Deep in the oral traditions of the Reach lives the legend of a child born in the Sundered Hills, greeted at birth by the screeching call of a bird and the crimson blooms of autumn scattered across the surrounding hillsides. They named him Faulan, meaning red eagle in the tongue of the Reach, a name meant to carry the weight of prophecy from his very first breath. The augurs who studied the omens surrounding his birth foresaw a singular destiny, a warrior without equal, first and foremost Lord of the Reach, chosen to unite the 10 scattered kings who ruled the fractured land in his era into a single, lasting nation. Scholars who later transcribed the tale from the memory of a student named Clarice Vienne note that much of it likely carries the weight of anachronism and embellishment, as any oral tradition passed down for 1,000 years inevitably does. Yet, the emotional truth of it, betrayal, sacrifice, and vengeance, still resonates through every forsworn camp scattered across the Reach today. Before we go further, it helps to remember that everything about the Reach traces back to this one legend. Every hag-raven shrine, every scrap of fur and bone worn by a forsworn warrior, every whispered oath sworn in the highlands, all lead back to a single betrayed prince from the Sundered Hills. Keep him in mind as we continue, because his shadow stretches across nearly every fact still to come tonight. The empress who conquered kings, Faulan's homeland was not yet the peaceful, unified nation the prophecy had promised him. 10 separate kings ruled different corners of the Reach, warring amongst themselves even as the augurs whispered of unity still to come. Then came Hestra, Empress of the South, marching her legions northward with conquest heavy on her mind and an empire's ambition behind every step. One by one, the kings of the Reach fell before her advancing armies, some accepting imperial bargains to spare their people further bloodshed. Others slaughtered outright on the battlefield when they refused to bend the knee to a foreign throne they did not recognize. Betrayed by his own elders, when Hestra's armies finally reached the Sundered Hills, envoys arrived to negotiate Faulan's surrender before any blood needed to be spilled. Faulan himself refused, unwilling to yield the freedom of his people to a foreign empire no matter what terms were offered. But his own elders, gripped by fear rather than the defiance their young lord embodied, cast him out entirely and accepted the imperial yoke he had so firmly rejected. In that single act of betrayal, Faulan lost everything that had once defined him, his land, his people, and even his own birth name, stolen from him by the very community the prophecy had promised he would one day lead into freedom. The price of vengeance. Cast out and stripped of everything that once gave his life meaning, Faulan transformed into something far more dangerous than a deposed prince wandering the wilderness. He became known as Red Eagle, the untamed spirit of the Reach, unbowed and stained with the blood of every foe unlucky enough to cross his path. Desperate for the strength to reclaim what had been stolen from him, he struck a bargain with a hag-raven, trading away his heart, his will, and his very humanity in exchange for the power to drive the invaders from his homeland once and for all. From that day forward, his spirit burned with a vengeance that knew no remorse, and by every account, absolutely no limit. 1,000 foreigners fall. For 2 years following his fateful pact with the hag-raven, Red Eagle and his gathered rebels proved nearly unstoppable, driving the foreign occupiers almost entirely from the wild reaches of their homeland. But peace could never truly last for a man who had traded away his soul for war. A massive imperial host descended upon his stronghold in response, laying siege for a full fortnight before Red Eagle finally emerged alone to meet them in single combat, robed in nothing but his own righteous fury. 1,000 foreign soldiers reportedly fell before his blade that single day, and the invading army broke and scattered in full retreat, one of the most lopsided victories the Reach had ever witnessed in its long and bloody memory. The sword that waits to return. Victory came at a devastating, irreversible cost for Red Eagle himself. When night finally fell after that legendary battle, so too did the hero, mortally wounded from the day's relentless fighting. In his final hours, witnesses claimed his eyes had cleared for the first time in years, the Hag Raven's dark influence finally lifting as death crept closer and closer. He was carried to a hidden tomb deep within the rock, where he presented his sword to his gathered people and swore a final oath before dying, that when the Reach was finally and fully free once more, his blade should be returned to him so that he might rise again to lead his people. That tomb, Rebel's Cairn, and that legendary sword, Red Eagle's Fury, remain findable in the Reach, even in the present era, a promise still technically, hauntingly unfulfilled. When the sword is finally returned to its altar, Red Eagle does rise again exactly as he swore, but not as the liberating hero his oath seemed to promise, only as a vengeful, undead guardian who attacks on sight, a bitter irony for a king whose final words were meant as a gift to his people rather than one last battle to be fought against them. The warlord who seized an empire. Centuries after Red Eagle's death faded into legend and campfire song, another Reach warlord would achieve something even the legendary hero never quite managed, actually seizing the imperial throne itself for his own people. In 2A533, a warlord known as Durkarak, called the Black Drake, gathered a massive horde of Reach warriors and marched directly on Cyrodiil, successfully claiming the Ruby Throne for himself against all odds. It marked one of the most stunning reversals in all of Tamrielic history, a people once conquered and cast aside now sitting atop the very empire that had spent centuries subjugating them without mercy. Imagine the poetry of it. Soldiers descended from the very tribes Hestra once crushed beneath her legions, marching triumphantly through the streets of Cyrodiil, carrying banners their ancestors had once been forced to burn. Plunder flows homeward. Durkarak's shocking conquest of Cyrodiil had ripple effects that reached all the way back to the mountain valley of Markarth. Once his Reachfolk armies controlled the Ruby Throne, they sent enormous amounts of plunder and captives back to their homeland, and more Reachfolk than ever before ventured abroad to seek their own fortunes in a suddenly, dizzyingly wide-open world. This period also brought Markarth back under a strange, complicated form of imperial authority, ruled now not by foreign conquerors from distant lands, but by its own former subjects turned unlikely emperors of the very empire that had once tried to erase them. The voice returns to stone. Long after Durkarak's reign faded into history, another figure would leave his own permanent mark on Markarth's legacy. Emperor Tiber Septim himself, uniter of all Tamriel. In gratitude for the crucial service the tongues, masters of the ancient way of the voice, had provided throughout Tamriel's long and complicated history, Tiber Septim established the Imperial College of the Voice right there within Markarth's stone walls. It was dedicated to reviving the art of the Thu'um for a new generation of students, ensuring that the mighty deeds of Nord heroes past might one day be equaled again on the battlefields of the present, echoing outward from the very city that had so often resisted outside authority. There's a quiet irony worth sitting with here too, that an emperor chose the most rebellious, most independently minded city in all of Skyrim as the place to cultivate a new generation devoted entirely to obedience and ancient discipline. blood on the ramparts. Not every chapter of Markarth's ruling history was written by outsiders or ancient legends passed down through generations. During the era of Ard-Kadak's rule, internal betrayal proved just as bloody as any foreign siege ever had. When members of his own kin rose in open rebellion against him, Ard-Kadak responded with brutal, uncompromising finality, executing every one of them by throwing them from the highest walls of the city, painting the stone ramparts below with their spilled blood. It stands as just the latest grim chapter written into the very stone of Markarth, a quiet reminder that the city's violence has never been confined to a single era or a single kind of enemy. Historians who study these accounts note how casually the records mention the punishment, as though throwing rebellious kin from the ramparts was simply an accepted cost of holding power in a city this old, this contested, and this used to blood soaking into its stone. A vampire's gambit. Around 2 E582, the city faced a threat unlike anything it had seen before, one that rose from within its own ancient foundations rather than from any human army. A Night Hollow vampire named Lady Belen staged an assault on Markarth, gathering her forces deep in the lower reaches of Nchuanzel itself, using the ancient Dwemer ruins beneath the city as a staging ground for her attack under cover of darkness. She clashed directly with the forces of Ard-Kadak, and though her assault was ultimately repelled after fierce fighting, the battle proved costly, with the Reachman warrior Arana wounded badly enough that outside help eventually became necessary to finish driving the vampire's forces from the city entirely. Lady Belen herself reportedly escaped deeper into the ruins rather than accept defeat outright, retreating toward an ancient orrery hidden within the Library of Arksand, a detail that suggests even Markarth's oldest, most forgotten chambers still held secrets worth killing for centuries after the Dwemer themselves had gone silent. Centuries would pass between Red Eagle's tomb and the events we're about to cover, but the pattern he set into motion never really broke. Empire came, Empire faded, and the Reach kept finding new champions and new betrayals to replace the old ones. By the time we reached the Fourth Era, the stage was already set for history to repeat itself one more time, only now with a very different cast of characters standing where Fowlan once stood. The uprising nobody saw coming. Fast forward to the Fourth Era, and Markarth found itself embroiled in the conflict that would come to define its entire modern reputation. In 4 E174, with the Empire consumed by the Great War against the Almeri Dominion, Imperial legionnaires stationed in Markarth were recalled to fight the Thalmor on distant battlefields elsewhere. The native Reachmen, sensing an opportunity 2,000 years in the making, seized the moment and rose up together, claiming Markarth and the surrounding Reach as their own independent kingdom, an uprising that would come to be known simply and infamously as the Forsworn Uprising. A king crowned in rags. The Forsworn Uprising did more than simply drive out foreign soldiers from the city. It completely overturned the existing power structure that had stood for generations. Jarl Hrolfdir, unable to quell the rebellion despite his best efforts, was driven out of Markarth entirely, and the Reachmen crowned their own leader in his place, a man who would come to be known throughout the land as Madnak, the king in rags. Under his rule, the Reach functioned as an independent kingdom separate from Skyrim for 2 full years, from 4 E174 until 4 E176. The closest the Reachmen had come to true self-governance since the earliest days of their scattered oral history. 2 peoples, 2 truths. What made the Forsworn Uprising so bitter and so lasting in its consequences? wasn't just the violence itself. It was the fundamental disagreement over what Markarth actually represented. The Reachmen believed sincerely in a legendary, historical, peaceful city-state that had once existed under their own rule long ago. But the Nords held no such cultural memory whatsoever, largely because the Skalds of Skyrim had historically ignored Reach legends entirely, treating them as unworthy of preservation or song. Without that shared history binding the two peoples together, Nords of every social class viewed the Reachmen only as savages and brutes, servants of a Daedric prince, incapable of legitimate rule, a perception gap that made any peaceful coexistence nearly impossible from the very start of their shared history. The militia that changed history, desperate to reclaim his city and unwilling to wait for imperial reinforcements that everyone knew would never actually arrive, Jarl Hrolfdir made a fateful decision that would ripple through Skyrim for decades. He formed a militia of Nords and recruited a young, ambitious warrior named Ulfric Stormcloak to lead the assault on Markarth's gates. It was a partnership built entirely out of desperate necessity, an empire too distracted by war abroad to properly defend its own holdings, and a local ruler willing to arm whoever could get the job done quickly, regardless of the long-term consequences that decision might eventually unleash upon the entire province. Neither Hrolfdir nor Ulfric could have known, standing at that gate with a hastily assembled militia, that the choices they were about to make would echo for decades, eventually splitting all of Skyrim into two warring factions over a religion that had nothing directly to do with the Reach at all. The incident that broke a promise. Ulfric's militia succeeded in retaking Markarth from the Forsworn, storming its gates and reclaiming the city street by street. But the manner of that victory left permanent scars on Skyrim's political landscape that never fully healed. What became known afterward as the Markarth incident saw the surviving Reachmen executed in large numbers, and the disillusionment this brutality caused in Ulfric and his men became one of the direct documented causes of the eventual Skyrim civil war. The broken trust between Nords and their supposed imperial allies over how the incident was handled planted the very seeds that would one day grow into the full Stormcloak rebellion. It's a strange thought to sit with, that the entire civil war tearing through Skyrim in the present day can trace one of its roots directly back to a single brutal afternoon in Markarth, where a young Ulfric first learned exactly how far his own allies were willing to go in the name of order. Fleeing into legend, once more, not every Reachman perished in the brutal retaking of Markarth that followed the uprising's collapse. The survivors of the uprising fled into the wild highlands of the Reach, adopting a new identity for themselves in the process, the Forsworn, a name that would come to define Reach resistance for generations still to come. Scattered but not broken by their defeat, they fortified any defensible position they could find across the region, transforming from a brief governing kingdom back into something closer to their ancient guerrilla roots, resuming a war for independence they had never truly abandoned in their hearts, even during their short years of open, official rule. With the uprising crushed and its survivors scattered into the hills, it's worth pausing to understand exactly what the Forsworn became in the decades that followed. They were no longer simply refugees hiding from Nord retaliation. They evolved into something far more organized, far more patient, and far more dangerous than anyone in Markarth's ruling class ever cared to admit out loud. Matriarchs of feather and bone. The Forsworn's spiritual and organizational structure centers entirely on reverence for hagravens, twisted magical beings treated as matriarchs within their society and consulted before major decisions. These creatures offer leadership and access to one of the Forsworn's most feared and archaic practices, a ritual involving the literal removal and replacement of a follower's own heart. This connects directly back to the legend of Red Eagle himself, who made his own pact with the Hag Raven centuries earlier, and based on what we know of both traditions, it's reasonable to assume his story isn't just an inspiration for the Forsworn, but quite possibly the actual origin point for many of their most sacred and brutal traditions still practiced today. Heart of Thorn, Bones of the Wild. The ritual known as the Briarheart Ceremony carries with it a specific, chilling incantation, recorded by scholars who dared study the practice from a very safe distance. Heart of Thorn, Bones of the Wild, in life forsworn, rise from death, blood of our blood, the words go, marking the transformation of an ordinary follower into something closer to a spirit of vengeance, pitiless and beyond all remorse. This purportedly grants extraordinary resilience and rage in battle, turning devoted Forsworn warriors into something that fights well past the point where an ordinary soldier would already have fallen and stopped moving entirely. Those who have witnessed a Briarheart warrior in combat describe an almost unnatural refusal to stay down, a fury that seems to draw strength directly from the wound itself, rather than being slowed by it, exactly the kind of horror the ritual's dark promise was always meant to deliver. An insurgency, not an army. Despite their savage reputation among outsiders, the Forsworn operate with a surprising degree of organizational sophistication that belies their wild appearance. Rather than functioning as a single unified army, they're structured as a series of smaller independent cells, each capable of striking fear into their gnawed occupiers without relying on the others for support. This decentralized approach to guerrilla warfare, popularly known simply as the Forsworn Rebellion, has allowed them to survive decades of Nord and Imperial suppression that might have crushed a more conventional fighting force entirely. Adapting the old tactics of espionage and terrain knowledge their ancestors once used against Hestra's legions centuries before. Agents hidden in plain sight. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Forsworn strategy is how deeply it infiltrates the very city they were supposedly driven out of decades ago. Despite appearing primitive to outside observers who only see the fur and bone, the Forsworn maintain agents living secretly among the ordinary population of Markarth, hidden in plain sight among merchants, servants, and even seemingly respected citizens. This astute grasp of insurgency warfare means that the war for the Reach never truly stopped when Ulfric's militia retook the city all those years ago. It simply moved underground, continuing in shadows and whispers rather than open, honest battle in the streets. A prisoner who never stopped ruling. When Ulfric's forces crushed the original uprising, Madanak himself was captured rather than killed outright, a decision that would haunt the Reach for years afterward. But his imprisonment in Sidna Mine was not the simple justice it appeared to be on the surface to most observers. Thonar Silverblood secretly arranged to keep Madanak imprisoned specifically as a way to leverage control over the Forsworn from behind the scenes, using the captured king as a tool for his own family's financial benefit, rather than allowing true justice or true freedom to run its natural course. It was a secret arrangement that would define Reach politics for years, hidden from nearly everyone, including Thonar's own unsuspecting family. Fashioned from fur and fear, Forsworn equipment carries a distinctive, unmistakable visual identity built from fur, feathers, bones, antlers, and, most disturbingly of all, the skulls of their own defeated victims worn as trophies. This savage aesthetic isn't merely intimidation for its own sake. it directly reflects the tribal garb and traditions depicted in the legend of Red Eagle, connecting every modern Forsworn warrior visually and spiritually back to the ancient hero whose sacrifice defines their entire cause. Wearing the bones of the fallen becomes both a badge of honor and a walking testament to the old ways they refuse to abandon, no matter how many centuries pass. Mines under mysterious protection. The Forsworn regularly target vulnerable mining operations scattered across the Reach, striking Kolskegger Mine and the small settlement of Karthweston with disturbing, almost predictable frequency and violence. What makes this pattern strange, once you look closely enough, is the quiet suggestion that these same operations exist mysteriously under the protective wing of the Silverblood family, even as they suffer repeated Forsworn attacks that never seem to actually stop. Whether this reflects genuine failed protection or something more calculated involving Thonar's secret dealings with Madanach remains one of the Reach's more unsettling open questions, a puzzle piece that only truly makes sense once the full conspiracy comes to light much later. Miners at these sites have grown almost fatalistic about the raids, rebuilding smelters and reinforcing gates, only to watch the pattern repeat itself again the following season, as though the violence itself has become just another cost of doing business, this deep in the Reach. A warrior marked by thorns. Not every Forsworn who undergoes the Briarheart ritual disappears back into the ranks of ordinary fighters. Some become something else entirely, a distinct and especially feared class of warrior, recognizable by the exposed, hollowed cavity in their own chest, where a still-beating, thorn-wrapped heart now sits in place of their own. These Briarheart warriors fight with a ferocity that unsettles even hardened Nord soldiers, wielding both blade and destructive magic with equal comfort, as though the ritual granted them power over more than just endurance alone. Encountering one in the wild is treated as a serious warning sign by travelers throughout the Reach, a signal that whatever camp lies ahead is defended by something considerably more dangerous than ordinary tribal warriors. A kingdom without walls. Unlike Markarth itself, with its gates and towers and clearly defined borders, the Forsworn hold no single capital and claim no fixed territory in the conventional sense. Instead, they maintain a scattered network of hidden strongholds and redoubts tucked throughout the wildest, least hospitable corners of the Reach, using the region's harsh mountains and hidden valleys as a natural fortress no outside army has ever fully mapped or conquered. This deliberate lack of a central target may be as much a strategy as it is a consequence of their exile, since a people with no single home to defend also have no single home an enemy can burn to end the war for good. The saying that explains everything. No phrase captures the dual nature of Markarth quite like the one locals repeat to newcomers and travelers passing through its gates for the very first time. Blood and silver are what flows through Markarth, the saying goes, a reference both to the cutthroat intrigue surrounding the city's silver-producing industry and to the endless violence between Forsworn rebels and Nord occupiers that has never fully ceased in all the centuries since. It's less a piece of quaint local colour and more a genuine warning, a summary of exactly what kind of place a visitor has wandered into the moment they pass through the city gates and hear the waterfalls beyond. While the Forsworn plotted in the highlands, another power entirely was quietly tightening its grip on the city itself from the inside. This power wore no fur or bone, carried no ancient grudge passed down through Hagraven ritual, and needed no army at all. It simply needed coin, patience, and a willingness to let anyone else take the blame for whatever it decided needed doing. Kings of a mountain of coin. There is perhaps no family in Markarth wealthier or more quietly influential than the Silverbloods, and the scale of their dominance shows in the simplest of facts. They own half the entire city outright, deed and stone alike. Their holdings include the Silverblood Inn near the main entrance, a good place for brawling, picking up bounties, or renting a warm room for the night, along with Sidna Mine itself, which doubles as both the city's most productive silver source and its most secure prison. Their reach into daily Markarth life is so total and so thorough that avoiding Silverblood influence entirely is essentially impossible for anyone living within the city walls. 2 brothers, 2 kingdoms. The Silverblood family's power rests on a careful, deliberate division of labor between 2 brothers with very different approaches to influence and control. Thongvor, the elder of the 2, spends the bulk of his time at Jarl Igmund's court inside Understone Keep, cultivating political connections and maintaining a respectable public face for the family name. Thonar, meanwhile, handles the actual business empire day to day, the mines, the inn, the treasury, and, as it turns out, secret dealings that Thongvor knows absolutely nothing about. This arrangement lets the family maintain a respectable public appearance, while its darker operations continue entirely unseen by even its own leadership. It's a curious kind of family loyalty, one built less on trust and more on carefully compartmentalized ignorance, where the brother chasing political favor never has to ask uncomfortable questions about exactly how the family's silver keeps flowing so reliably. A marriage built on honesty about money. Betrid Silverblood, Thonar's wife, holds few illusions about the true nature of her own marriage, and she's remarkably candid about it with anyone who asks. She openly admits that she married Thonar purely for his wealth, a confession she delivers without a trace of shame or hesitation whenever the topic arises in idle conversation. Before her marriage elevated her social status considerably, Betrid actually lived at the Temple of Dibella, a background she occasionally alludes to in passing, before trading a life of modest devotion for one of considerable, if emotionally hollow, luxury within Markarth's wealthiest household. She rarely hides her boredom either, spending most days simply reading by the fire in the treasury house, a woman who traded spiritual purpose for gold and, by her own quiet admission, has never once regretted the exchange. The guards who answer to silver. Thonar's influence over Markarth extends well beyond his own business holdings and directly into the very machinery of law enforcement itself. He wields significant unofficial power by bribing the city guards to answer to him personally, effectively placing a private security force at his disposal that technically still wears the uniform of the Jarl's own soldiers. This arrangement means that justice in Markarth often bends quietly toward whatever serves Silverblood interests, regardless of what the written law technically states. A corruption so normalized and so old that most citizens simply accept it as how the city has always worked and always will. Visitors who run afoul of the Silverbloods quickly learn that appealing to the guards for protection is often pointless, since the very people meant to enforce impartial justice have already been quietly purchased by the family they might otherwise need protecting from. A name earned in the mines. The Silverblood name itself carries the weight of family history compressed into 2 words, and though no single surviving text confirms exactly how the name was first earned, it's reasonable to assume it traces back to whichever ancestor first staked a claim to Markarth's silver veins and was willing to spill blood, their own or someone else's, to keep it. Whether the name began as a boast or simply an honest description of the family business, it has aged into something closer to a warning, a surname that tells newcomers everything they need to know about how this particular family built its fortune. The city's chief export, Markarth has long stood as one of Skyrim's most significant sources of silver, its mines feeding coin purses, jewelry counters, and smithing forges across the entire province in numbers few other holds can match. Given that the Silverbloods control the city's most productive mine outright, it's fair to assume that a meaningful share of the silver traded anywhere in Skyrim can trace its origin back to Sydna Mine's veins, however many hands and however many borders it eventually passes through. That single fact alone explains why a family already this wealthy still bothers guarding its claims so ruthlessly, since controlling the ore itself means controlling a currency the rest of the province quietly depends on. The nose behind the numbers, one of the most quietly dangerous figures in all of Markarth, spends his days handling paperwork rather than wielding any weapon. Nepos the Nose, an elder reachman with a harmless, doddering reputation, secretly administers Sydna Mine's operations and smelter business on behalf of Thonar, managing all the tedious administrative details that keep the Silverblood Silver Empire running smoothly year after year. What Thonar doesn't fully appreciate is that Nepos serves an entirely different master beneath his loyal, obedient exterior, using his administrative access to further the forsworn cause from directly inside the enemy's own financial operation. He plays the part perfectly, an old man content to read quietly by the fire, surrounded by servants who love and protect him, never once betraying through word or expression the 2 decades of quiet betrayal he's been orchestrating from that same comfortable chair. Forced labor beneath the city. Sydna Mine functions as far more than a simple prison carved into stone. It's an engine of forced production that keeps Silverblood coffers overflowing year after year. Mercenaries hired by the family guard the mine's perimeter and interior alike, while the prisoners held within are compelled to labor extracting silver ore as forced workers, their punishment doubling as unpaid industrial output for someone else's fortune. This arrangement produces a significant portion of all the silver that flows out of Skyrim entirely, meaning a meaningful percentage of the region's wealth quite literally comes from the broken backs of men and women locked away, often unjustly, beneath Markarth's own streets. The irony rarely escapes anyone who spends enough time in the city that the very silver decorating the fine clothes of Dryside nobility was very likely dragged out of the mountain by someone who never received a single coin for the labor. A city split by a river. Markarth's geography enforces a social divide as sharp as any written law could ever create on its own. The city is physically split by the running Karth River into 2 distinct halves. Riverside, home to the native Reachmen and the city's working-class labor district, and Dryside, where Nord nobility and every Silverblood holding of real consequence can be found gathered together. This isn't a subtle distinction meant to be discovered slowly. It's baked directly into the architecture and daily movement patterns of everyone who lives there. A constant visual reminder of exactly where power and poverty each choose to reside within the city's ancient stone walls. Life dug into the cliff. For the poorest residents of Markarth, home isn't a proper building at all. It's a section of the city called the Warrens, quite literally dug directly into the surrounding cliff face by hand. Many of the people living in extreme poverty here work in the nearby mine and at the smelters, performing the dangerous, exhausting labor that keeps Markarth's entire silver economy running while receiving almost none of its considerable rewards for themselves. The Warrens stand as the starkest physical evidence of the divide between the city's wealthy dry side and everyone else quietly struggling to survive on considerably less each and every day. Now that we understand who holds the coin and who holds the old grudges, it's finally time to watch those two forces collide directly. What follows is the true story of how one quiet afternoon in a Markarth marketplace unraveled years of secrets, exposing a conspiracy that connected a supposedly defeated rebellion all the way to the wealthiest family in the entire Reach. An attack in the open market. The conspiracy that would eventually unravel Markarth's darkest secrets began, as these things often do in the Reach, with sudden and shocking public violence. While shopping for jewelry in the open marketplace on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, a woman named Margaret was viciously attacked by a Breton witchblade named Waylin, who shouted a chilling declaration as he attempted to flee the scene. The Reach belongs to the Forsworn. It was a bold, public statement of intent from a movement most citizens had comfortably assumed was safely contained to the distant wilderness beyond the city walls, not lurking in their own marketplace. A spy hiding in plain sight. Margaret's own story turns out to be far more complicated than that of a simple, innocent victim caught in random Forsworn violence. A search of her private diary, kept hidden in her rented room at the Silverblood Inn, reveals a startling truth that changes everything. Margaret was actually operating as an imperial spy, sent quietly to investigate the very conspiracy that ultimately targeted her for elimination. Her presence in Markarth was never accidental in the slightest, and her attack strongly suggests that whatever she was investigating had gotten dangerously close to the truth before Waylin ever drew his weapon against her in the crowded square. The note that named a letter. Waylin's cramped room in the impoverished Warrens district yields a crucial clue once investigators finally search it thoroughly enough. A note that references a mysterious figure identified only by the single letter N. This scrap of evidence becomes the thread that unravels the entire conspiracy from top to bottom, pointing towards someone influential enough to direct Forsworn violence, yet careful enough to keep their real name entirely out of any written correspondence. A level of caution that itself hints at just how dangerous and well-connected this mysterious N truly turns out to be. Whoever left that note clearly understood the risk of writing anything down at all in a city this small, and the fact that even a single letter survived to be found suggests carelessness born of decades spent believing no one would ever dare look closely enough to notice. 20 years of quiet betrayal. The letter N eventually leads investigators to Nepos the Nose, an elderly Reachman who has spent almost 2 decades secretly directing Forsworn violence from behind a comfortable facade of harmless old age. Nepos himself grows visibly weary when finally confronted with the truth, confessing quietly that he's been playing this game for almost 20 years, sending the young to their deaths, all in the name of the Forsworn, and admitting openly just how tired he has become of the endless bloodshed his loyalty has always demanded of him. Servants who were never servants. Nepos surrounds himself with what appear to be devoted household servants, Tynan, Morven and Wayle, each one seemingly caring and protective of their elderly, frail-looking employer. In reality, every single one of them serves as a Forsworn agent, assigned specifically to watch over Nepos and protect his secret operations from unwanted outside discovery. When his true loyalties are finally exposed, all three reveal themselves at once, drawing weapons alongside their supposed master in a coordinated defense that shatters any lingering illusion of innocent domestic service in an instant. The king who rules from prison. Under sustained questioning, Nepos reveals perhaps the most important piece of the entire puzzle, that Madanag, imprisoned within Sidna Mine for many long years, has never actually stopped ruling the Forsworn for even a single day. He directs the downtrodden citizens of Markarth to kill in the name of the cause entirely from within his own prison cell, coordinating an active insurgency from behind bars that most of the city comfortably assumes has been neutralized for good. It's a revelation that reframes absolutely everything, proving that imprisoning a king does nothing to silence him if his followers remain devoted enough to carry out his will from the outside world. A wife sacrificed for silence. The conspiracy's investigation eventually leads directly to Thonar Silverblood's own household, with devastating and irreversible personal consequences for everyone involved. When pressed about Margaret's murder, Thonar's wife Bettrid becomes collateral damage in the unfolding chaos, killed by hidden Forsworn agents Nana Ildeen and Donnell, both of whom had been secretly embedded within the Silverblood household itself for years without suspicion. Her death exposes just how deeply Forsworn infiltration truly extends, reaching not just into ordinary Markarth society, but directly into the private home of the very family that supposedly holds the most power over the entire Reach. For all of Thonar's wealth, his bribed guards, and his secret arrangements, he never once suspected that the danger he'd spent years managing from a distance had already moved into his own household, wearing a familiar, trusted face the entire time. A deal gone terribly wrong. Following Bettrid's death, a furious and grieving Thonar finally reveals the truth he's kept hidden even from his own family for years. He had struck a secret arrangement with Madanach long ago, using his position to keep the Forsworn king safely contained and, in exchange, controlling the level of violence the movement was permitted to unleash across the wider Reach. That careful, cynical balance shattered the moment outside investigation began poking into corners it never should have touched, and Thonar's own wife paid the ultimate price for a deal he'd made purely for Silverblood profit, rather than any genuine desire for peace between his people and hers. The blacksmith who knew too much. Caught in the middle of this entire unraveling conspiracy is Eltris, an ordinary Markarth blacksmith trying only to do the right thing by investigating the truth behind Margaret's murder. His pursuit of justice makes him dangerously inconvenient to powerful people standing on both sides of the conspiracy, and he ultimately pays for his persistence with his own life, murdered by corrupt Markarth guards acting to protect Thonar's secret and silence the investigation for good. His death marks the conspiracy's final, tragic casualty and sets the stage for an entirely unjust accusation to fall upon whoever dared to help him uncover the truth in the very first place. His body is left at the Shrine of Talos as a message as much as a murder. Proof that even a quiet man asking careful questions in Markarth can find himself buried before the answers ever see daylight. The captain who looked away. With Eltris silenced and the conspiracy threatening to unravel entirely, the corruption reaches its final and most damning turn through Ogmund, the captain of the guard, who moves quickly to close the case by framing an outsider for the murders rather than pursuing the truth any further. That the city's own top law enforcement officer would rather manufacture a conviction than risk exposing the Silverbloods or the Forsworn hiding within his own ranks says everything about how completely Markarth's official justice has been hollowed out from the inside. It's a fitting final note to the whole affair, proof that the corruption uncovered here was never confined to one wealthy family or one desperate rebellion, but had quietly settled into the very institution meant to prevent it. Mine for your freedom. The moment the iron gate of Sidnamine closes behind a new prisoner, an orc taskmaster named Urzoga Grashugurs makes the terms of survival brutally clear. That freedom here isn't granted, it's mined. one swing of the pickaxe at a time until the ore quota is somehow met. There is no sentence to serve and no date circled on a calendar. Only endless labor against silver veins that never seem to run dry, no matter how many years a prisoner spends chipping away at them in the dark. For anyone framed and dropped into this pit expecting eventual release through good behavior, Urzoga's flat announcement lands like a second sentencing, a reminder that Thonar's Silverblood's mind cares nothing for guilt or innocence, only output, and that the ledger books upstairs matter far more than any question of justice down here beneath the mountain. Prisoners who arrive expecting some formal review of their case quickly learn there isn't one coming. Only quotas, only silver, only the same grinding routine repeating itself for however many years fate decides to grant them. The miner who knows the stories. Deep inside the mine's tunnels sits a prisoner named Urikten, huddled by a small fire and remarkably willing to talk despite years of confinement in a place that has clearly hardened everyone else around him into silence. He becomes the first real source of information for anyone trying to navigate the mine's hidden social order, offering colourful, almost entertaining stories about the mine's most feared inmate, before revealing the actual obstacle standing between any new prisoner and the man they've come looking for. His willingness to chat, oddly warm given the setting, makes him something like an unofficial welcoming committee for the damned. A man who seems to have found a strange kind of peace in simply outlasting everyone else's despair around him, one long, grinding day at a time. There's something almost gentle about the way he treats each new arrival, as though he's long since accepted his own fate, and would rather spend his remaining years passing along useful knowledge than adding to the mine's already crushing atmosphere of misery. Other prisoners seem to tolerate his talkativeness with a kind of weary fondness, the way a small community learns to live around its one remaining storyteller, once every other comfort has long since been stripped away. A toll paid in steel. Standing between any prisoner and Madonach's private cell is an enormous orc named Borkul the Beast, a bodyguard who demands payment before allowing anyone near his king, no matter how important that visitor believes their own business to be. His price isn't gold or favors, it's a shiv, a crude improvised weapon that holds obvious value inside a mine, where every prisoner is otherwise unarmed, and every day could end in violence over the smallest imagined slight. That such a simple object commands so much leverage says everything about how survival actually works in Sidna Mine, where influence isn't measured in coin, but in whatever sharp object you can smuggle past the guards and keep hidden from Urzoga's ever-watchful, humorless eye. In a place where every prisoner has been stripped of weapons, status, and freedom alike, a single crude shiv becomes currency more valuable than gold ever was on the surface. Skooma for a sharpened edge. Getting that shiv requires navigating yet another prisoner's price. A broken man named Grisva the Unlucky, who trades the weapon only in exchange for a bottle of skooma, smuggled in from outside the mine's walls through means nobody dares to ask about too closely. It's a small transaction that reveals an entire hidden economy thriving beneath the mine's surface, one built on addiction, favors, and desperation, rather than anything resembling honest currency or fair, transparent dealing between equals. Every layer of this negotiation, shiv for skooma, access for shiv, audience for access, illustrates just how much structure and hierarchy exists inside a place most outsiders assume is simple chaos. A whole miniature society operating entirely in the shadows of official punishment and forgotten paperwork. Guards patrolling above rarely bother investigating how such contraband keeps circulating below, either through genuine ignorance or a quiet, unspoken agreement that some corruption is simply easier to overlook than to stop. The king behind the guarded door. Even after clearing every obstacle Borkul demands, reaching Madanak himself requires one final negotiation, whether through brawling, bribery, or careful persuasion, before his private cell door finally opens to reveal the man everyone in the mine speaks of in hushed, almost reverent tones. It's a fittingly theatrical barrier for a man who once ruled an entire kingdom and now commands loyalty from prisoners, even while confined behind bars himself, decades removed from the throne he briefly, gloriously held. Everything about the layered security surrounding him, the bodyguard, the toll, the locked door, suggests that whatever remains of Madanak's power has been carefully, deliberately preserved by the very system meant to have broken him long ago and never quite managed it. It raises an uncomfortable question that lingers long after the door finally opens, whether Sidna Mine was ever truly meant to contain him at all, or simply to keep him conveniently out of sight, while his influence continued operating exactly as intended. A beast among beasts. When Madanak finally speaks face to face with a new arrival, his words carry a bitter, knowing edge that cuts straight to the heart of what Sidna Mine actually does to the people trapped inside it over time. He observes coldly that the Nords have turned his visitor into an animal, a wild beast caged up and left to go mad, before asking pointedly what exactly this newly caged beast actually wants from him, now that they've finally arrived at his door. It's less a greeting than an appraisal. One prisoner sizing up another, testing whether this new arrival has come seeking simple revenge or something far more dangerous. Actual answers about the forsworn cause he spent decades defending from inside a cell most men would have long since surrendered to, entirely and forgotten. His eyes, by every account, never quite lose their sharpness during this exchange. The gaze of a man who has clearly spent every one of those long years thinking, rather than simply enduring. A story worth hearing. First, before offering any deal or explanation of his own, Madanak insists that any newcomer first seek out a fellow prisoner named Braig and listen to his personal account of what brought him to this mine and to the forsworn cause more broadly in the first place. It's a curious demand from a man who could simply explain everything himself, suggesting that Madanak values persuasion through lived experience over his own words alone, understanding perhaps better than anyone that second-hand testimony from a fellow sufferer carries more weight than a king's own justification ever could to someone raised entirely on gnawed suspicion of the Reach and its people. It's also, quietly, a test of patience, a way to see whether a newcomer is genuinely willing to listen before demanding anything for themselves. Proof paid in blood. Freedom, according to Madanak, is never given freely, only earned through demonstrated loyalty, and the specific proof he demands from a newcomer is chilling in its cold, businesslike practicality. He orders the assassination of Grisvar the Unlucky, the very same broken prisoner who traded away his shiv for skooma earlier, dismissing him coldly as someone who has simply outlived his usefulness to the forsworn cause after years of quiet, unglamorous service. It's a brutal illustration of exactly how expendable individual lives become within Madanak's larger political calculations. Even the lives of prisoners who have already suffered years alongside him in the same dark tunnels, sharing the same meager fires and the same slow, grinding hopelessness night after night. Grisvar never sees the betrayal coming, having spent years believing his usefulness to the cause guaranteed at least some measure of protection from the very king he served so faithfully underground, the hole that guards already know. When escape finally comes, it arrives through what should be an obvious security failure. A large, extremely visible hole in the mine's wall that leads directly out into the streets of Markarth above. Hardly the sort of thing a competent warden would overlook for years without noticing. And yet the guards seem entirely unsurprised by this route, gathering right at its exit alongside the mine's own owner, as though they'd been expecting an escape attempt from this exact spot the entire time it had existed. The detail suggests something darker than simple incompetence, that this escape route may have always existed as a controlled release valve, a way to periodically thin out Sydney Mine's population under carefully managed circumstances that only the Silverbloods themselves fully understand or profit from, whether by design or by decades of quiet neglect. The hole has apparently become such an open secret that guards no longer bother pretending surprise when yet another desperate prisoner comes crawling through it toward daylight. Two paths from the same tunnel. Every prisoner who reaches this tunnel faces one final defining choice: escape alongside Madanach and the remaining Forsworn to fight another day somewhere else in the wilderness, or kill him where he stands and walk out entirely alone into an uncertain welcome. Choosing loyalty earns a reward of armor of the old gods and lasting welcome at the Forsworn's new stronghold in Druadach Redoubt, while choosing betrayal earns a Silverblood family ring and a very different reception back among Markarth's official circles of power. Neither choice resolves the deeper conspiracy cleanly. Both simply decide which version of the Reach's endless cycle of violence continues turning without you standing directly in its way any longer. A war that will keep grinding on regardless of which side wins this one particular night beneath the mountain. It's a rare moment in Skyrim when neither available ending feels like a true victory, only a choice about which flavor of ongoing tragedy you're personally willing to walk away from. Whatever choice gets made in that tunnel, the story of Markarth's underground doesn't end with Sydney Mine. There's an entire second world buried beneath the city streets, one built by hands far older and far stranger than any human miner could ever hope to match, and it's still very much awake down there, patiently waiting to be found by someone curious enough to go looking for it. The palace built from a ruin, Understone Keep, the seat of power for whoever rules Markarth, isn't really a palace in any conventional sense at all. It's simply the surviving exterior shell of ancient Nchuan Zel, repurposed by generations of human rulers who never fully understood what they'd inherited when they first claimed it as their own royal seat. The Jarl's own seat of power carries a name as somber as the city surrounding it: the Mournful Throne, a title that predates every Nord who has ever sat upon it, and speaks to some older, forgotten grief the Dwemer themselves may have carried into this exact hall long before humans ever arrived in the Reach to claim it for their own purposes. No surviving text explains exactly what tragedy inspired the name, leaving every ruler who has since occupied that seat to govern beneath a title whose true meaning vanished, along with the very civilization that first carved it into stone. A dig site guarded by danger. Beneath the keep's more livable chambers lies the Nchuan Zel excavation site, an active dig overseen personally by Calkelmo, Markarth's resident court wizard and self-declared authority on all things Dwemer across the entire continent of Tamriel. Getting permission to explore requires patience, since the excavation remains deliberately restricted, guarded not out of simple bureaucratic caution, but because the ruins genuinely still contain functioning ancient machinery and traps that have continued operating flawlessly for thousands of years without any maintenance whatsoever, indifferent to whether anyone still remembers how they were built or what original purpose they were ever meant to serve. Workers who have spent years on the dig still speak carefully around certain corridors, aware that a single misplaced step could trigger defenses installed by hands that turned to dust long before the first Nord ever set foot in the Reach. The spider, with a name, progress on the excavation ground to a halt entirely because of one particularly large and aggressive obstacle, a giant frostbite spider that Calcelmo's own workers affectionately, or perhaps fearfully, nicknamed Nimhe, meaning the poisoned one in whatever half-remembered dialect the workers had cobbled together for the purpose over long shifts underground. That the workers bothered naming their obstacle at all says something about how personal and how prolonged their standoff with the creature had become. A monster significant enough to earn its own identity among people whose entire professional lives now revolved around finding a way past it and back to the actual work waiting beyond her web. 2 human lifetimes of obsession. Calcelmo doesn't consider his research a simple career. He describes the wealth of Dwemer artifacts beneath Markarth as the foundation for 2 entire human lifetimes of dedicated scholarship. A phrase that reveals just how consuming his fascination with the vanished race has become over the many decades of his life. He has authored a full series of scholarly volumes on Dwemer culture and history, and stands perpetually on the edge of completing what he considers his true masterwork, a comprehensive guide to translating the ancient farmer language that he insists will revolutionize how all of Tamriel understands those tragic, twisted beings once and for all time. Colleagues who have corresponded with him across the years describe a man perpetually one season away from finishing, forever pushing the completion date further into the future as new discoveries keep complicating his already decades-long research. The stone that guards a secret. Deep within Calcelmo's private tower sits an enormous relic he refers to simply as his former Rosetta Stone, a massive granite slab bearing text in both Dwemer and Fulmer script side by side, quite possibly the very same agreement of servitude struck by his ancient predecessors centuries earlier in Inchuanzel's original halls. This single stone represents the absolute key to his life's work, and he protects it with an almost paranoid intensity, refusing to let anyone view even a fragment of his research before it's fully complete. Convinced that rival scholars elsewhere in Tamriel would happily steal decades of his labor the very moment they got the chance to see it firsthand. A love left unspoken. For all his intellectual brilliance, Calcelmo harbors a far more ordinary secret entirely unrelated to dead languages or ancient machinery. Quiet, romantic feelings for Feline, the Jarl's own housecarl stationed just down the hall from his laboratory every single day of the year. When this affection eventually comes to light, Feline reacts with genuine surprise and more than a little dismissal, insisting that the old scholar is far more interested in dead dwarves than in anybody actually standing in front of him, breathing and alive. It's a gentle irony given how much of his own life he spent chasing, exactly the kind of connection he apparently struggles to express out loud to the very person he clearly admires from a respectful, scholarly distance. Other residents of the keep seem to find the whole situation quietly amusing, trading knowing glances whenever Calcelmo finds some flimsy excuse to wander past Feline's quarters on his way to somewhere he technically didn't need to be at all. A nephew, who would rather not, Icantar, Calcelmo's own nephew and closest assistant, doesn't share his uncle's boundless enthusiasm for descending into dangerous, spider-infested ruins on a regular basis, no matter how many times he's politely asked to help with the excavation. He's been overheard quietly asking whether he might simply skip the next dig entirely, only to be firmly reminded by his uncle that he remains a vital part of the research team, whether he likes the idea or not, and that no amount of gentle protest will change his uncle's mind on the matter at hand. It's a small, human moment of workplace reluctance, tucked inside an otherwise grand scholarly enterprise. A reminder that even legendary research efforts still run on ordinary family obligation, and a nephew simply too dutiful to ever walk away for good. Whatever fear Ikanta privately carries about Nimhe or the ruins' other dangers, he shows up again every single time his uncle calls. An unglamorous kind of loyalty that rarely earns songs or statues, but keeps the excavation moving forward all the same. Treasures. Behind a locked door. Calselmo's private museum showcases the most valuable finds pulled from beneath the city, including at various points a rare stone of Baranzyre and, more dramatically, an artifact known as Stendar's hammer, unearthed from deep within Markarth and put proudly on display for scholarly admiration by visiting nobles and curious travelers passing through the keep. That particular prize didn't stay on its pedestal for long, however, stolen from the museum not long after Calcelmo first acquired it. Proof that even a heavily guarded collection curated by a paranoid, protective scholar isn't entirely safe from Markarth's less academically inclined residents looking for an easy, valuable score. Silence and suspicion under one roof. Understone Keep quietly hosts one of the tensest arrangements in all of Skyrim. A Thalmor Justicia named Ondalamar pacing openly near the throne room to enforce the empire-wide ban on Talos worship, while the Jarl's own steward, Rarek, secretly continues worshipping the very god Ondalamar, has been sent specifically to suppress under threat of imprisonment or something considerably worse. Neither man acknowledges the other's true position directly, creating a strange daily theatre of watchfulness and quiet defiance playing out in the same drafty stone hallways day after day, a microcosm of the exact religious tension that had already ignited open rebellion across the rest of Skyrim entirely. Anyone standing quietly in that throne room for long enough eventually notices the two men orbiting each other with the wary, practiced distance of chess pieces that both know exactly what the other one is capable of doing. There's something fitting about a scholar spending 2 lifetimes chasing secrets buried beneath a city built entirely on secrets of its own making. But not every mystery in Markarth stays buried underground. Some of the oldest ones climbed a mountain instead, hidden inside a temple most people in Skyrim don't even know still exists at all in the present day. An outpost older than the Empire. Long before it ever became a headquarters for the Blades, Skyhaven Temple served as a functioning outpost for the ancient Dragon Guard during their earliest conflicts against dragons in the First Era, built directly into the mountainside east of Markarth, where few outsiders ever thought to look twice. Its origins as an Akaviri military installation predate nearly every human institution still standing in modern Skyrim, meaning that the temple's stones have witnessed dragon warfare not once but twice, separated by literally thousands of years between one conflict and the next, a coincidence of history that even its own ancient builders could never have possibly predicted or prepared for. A rebellion against forced service. In the year 2804, the temple found itself at the center of the Winterhold Rebellion, an uprising sparked by furious protest against forced military conscription being imposed on the local populace by Akaviri overseers who cared little for local grievances or suffering. The unrest escalated the following year into an outright siege of the temple itself, a standoff that only lifted once Raymond II finally ascended to the throne, and presumably addressed whatever grievances had driven ordinary people to besiege an ancient military stronghold in the first place after years of quiet resentment. It stands as a rare example of the temple's own guardians briefly becoming its besiegers rather than its defenders. A strange historical footnote for a place otherwise remembered almost entirely for standing firm against dragons rather than against its own conscripted people. The wall built to outlast memory. Grateful for whatever resolution followed the rebellion, Emperor Raymond II granted formal permission in 1 E 2812 for the construction of Alduin's Wall within the temple's inner sanctum, an enormous stone monument meant to preserve everything the ancient Dragon Guard and their successors had learned about dragons and prophecy for generations of scholars still to come. The wall was built specifically as a hedge against the forgetfulness of centuries, a physical insurance policy against exactly the kind of dragon crisis that would eventually engulf Skyrim thousands of years later, precisely as its cautious, foresighted builders had apparently always feared it might happen again someday, that such foresight would eventually prove not just wise, but genuinely necessary, saving an entire province from ruin thousands of years after the wall's completion, stands as one of the most remarkable long-term investments any civilization in Tamriel's long history ever quietly made. Guarded by the Wild Reach itself, reaching Skyhaven Temple at all requires passing through Karthspire, a rugged mountain pass thick with forsworn warriors and, more dangerously, at least one hagraven making her lair among the rocks and shadows of the surrounding cliffs and ravines. The temple's ancient builders could hardly have anticipated exactly who would eventually be guarding their sacred approach centuries later. Yet the natural difficulty of the terrain itself has done more to protect Alduin's Wall from casual discovery than any locked door or hidden passage ever could accomplish entirely on its own. A door that only opens for blood. Deep within Karthspire's caverns sits one of the most literal security measures in all of Tamriel, a blood seal, an ancient Akaviri mechanism that responds to nothing except a small offering of the visitor's own blood spilled directly onto the waiting stone circle beneath it. It stands as a small but visceral reminder of just how differently the Akaviri approach security compared to the mechanical, logic-driven puzzles the Dwemer preferred beneath Markarth's own streets, favouring something far more primal and personal instead of clever gears, levers, and rotating symbols. There's a certain grim poetry in a temple meant to protect all of Tamriel from destruction, requiring nothing more sophisticated than a single drop of blood to prove that whoever stands before it is truly willing to bleed for the cause hidden within. Pillars that speak in symbols. Before reaching the blood seal, visitors must first solve a puzzle involving 3 rotating stone pillars, each marked with unique symbols that must be aligned correctly to lower a stone bridge, blocking the only path forward toward the temple itself. The solution, aligning every pillar to display the same distinctive symbol associated with dragon-born heroes throughout history, feels almost like the ancient Akaviri builders were testing specifically for someone destined to eventually walk this exact path, rather than simply any curious traveller who happened to wander this far into the mountain by pure accident or lost misfortune. It's the kind of design choice that only makes complete sense in hindsight. A puzzle seemingly built centuries in advance for a visitor its original architects could never have possibly met. An armory, waiting for heroes. Inside the temple's small but well-stocked armory sits a complete set of ancient blades armor, alongside one of the more legendary weapons in all of Skyrim, a sword called Dragonbane, crafted specifically and uniquely effective against dragonkind in a way few other blades anywhere in Tamriel can properly match. That such powerful, purpose-built equipment sat waiting undisturbed for centuries speaks to just how thoroughly forgotten this temple had become before its eventual rediscovery. An arsenal prepared for a war its original keepers desperately hoped would never actually need fighting again in their own lifetime, or any that followed after them. Every buckle and blade in that armory had simply been sitting in the dark, polished by nothing but time and silence, waiting for hands capable of finally putting it back to its intended terrible use. A new home for an old order. Once the temple is finally rediscovered and cleared of danger, the last surviving members of the ancient Blades Order make a fateful decision to re-establish their entire operation here, transforming Skyhaven Temple back into a genuine headquarters for the first time in longer than anyone can properly account for in the historical record available today. It's a quiet, poignant full circle for a location built originally to fight dragons, now serving that exact same purpose once more after centuries spent gathering dust and legend, rather than actual dragon's lairs walking its silent, echoing halls. The last surviving members of a nearly extinguished order finally find themselves standing exactly where their earliest predecessors once stood, staring at the same wall, carrying the same burden, separated from those first Dragon Guard only by an almost unimaginable stretch of forgotten centuries. Sworn in beneath the mountain. Once re-established as Blade's headquarters, the temple gains the ability to formally induct new members into the Ancient Order, allowing up to 3 trusted companions to be sworn in and take up permanent residence within its ancient, echoing stone walls forever afterward. Each new blade essentially trades their former life entirely for service to this ancient cause, a serious, largely irreversible commitment that echoes the same weight of sacrifice the original Akaviri Dragon Guard would likely have recognized instantly, even across thousands of years of separation and cultural distance between the two orders. A view over the very gold being stolen. From the temple's open-air courtyard, observers can actually look directly down upon Kolskegger Mine in the valley below, one of the very gold mines regularly targeted by forsworn raiders throughout the wider reach and its surrounding hills. It's a striking, almost unbearably ironic vantage point, an ancient sanctuary dedicated to defending Tamriel from apocalyptic dragons sitting in perfect, silent view of a much smaller, far more mundane conflict still playing out over gold and territory in the valley, far beneath its ancient, indifferent, watchful walls. Whoever originally chose this exact site for a Dragon Guard outpost could never have imagined that centuries later, its greatest strategic value might simply be the view it offers of ordinary miners defending their livelihood against ordinary raiders, rather than any dragons circling overhead. For all its history of dragons and prophecy, Skyhaven Temple was never Markarth's only brush with forces beyond the mortal world. Closer to the city gates, in houses that look perfectly ordinary from the outside, something considerably darker has been quietly waiting for centuries for the right unsuspecting visitor to finally arrive and open the door. A house that never ages. Near the main entrance to Markarth sits an unremarkable abandoned house, the kind easily overlooked by travelers hurrying past toward the marketplace beyond, without so much as a second glance in its direction. What makes it genuinely unsettling upon closer inspection is that it shows absolutely no signs of the decay or aging one would expect from true abandonment, with fresh food still sitting out inside as though someone had simply stepped away moments ago, rather than years or decades before that very same quiet afternoon. dust that should have settled thick across every surface simply never arrives, as though time itself moves differently the moment anyone crosses that particular threshold. A vigilant walks into a trap. A witch hunter named Tyrannus, a devoted vigilant of Stendar sworn to root out Daedric influence wherever it hides across all of Skyrim, becomes convinced this particular house holds evidence of ancient Daedric worship and asks for help investigating further before word can spread. Neither he nor his eventual companion fully grasps that agreeing to help means walking directly into a carefully laid trap. One patient enough to have waited undisturbed inside that house for who knows how many years before finally finding suitable visitors willing to step through its quiet front door. His confidence walking in, so certain of his own experience hunting Daedra, makes the eventual reveal of exactly what waits inside all the more unsettling by contrast. Furniture that moves on its own. The moment the house's true nature reveals itself, ordinary objects begin floating and shifting as though gravity itself has quietly stopped applying inside these particular walls. An unsettling display meant to convince anyone present that whatever lurks here operates by rules considerably older and stranger than the physical world outside its front door and windows. Tyrannus's genuine, visible panic in this moment underscores just how far this encounter exceeds anything even a seasoned Daedra hunter typically expects to face inside an ordinary city house on an otherwise perfectly ordinary evening. Witnesses who have survived similar encounters elsewhere in Skyrim describe this exact style of manipulation as a Moloch Baal signature, patient theatre designed to strip away a victim's composure long before any actual violence even begins. A prince with a personal grudge. The voice controlling the house eventually identifies itself as Molag Baal, Daedric Prince of Domination, and one of the most feared entities in the entire Daedric pantheon, revealing that this elaborate trap exists purely to exact personal revenge against a servant of his rival, Boethia, over some ancient slight neither prince has apparently forgotten across the centuries. The mundane appearance of the house makes this revelation land even harder. A genuinely cosmic scale grudge being pursued through the humblest possible setting. An abandoned home a few dozen steps from Markarth's busiest street corner, and it's unaware, everyday foot traffic passing by. Somewhere in oblivion, an entire feud between two immortal princes hinges entirely on the actions of whichever mortal happens to wander into this particular house on this particular day. A scale of consequence utterly disproportionate to the modest, unremarkable building holding it all together. The priest who desecrates the altar. Molag Baal's target turns out to be a wandering priest named Logrolf the Willful, a devoted servant of Boethia, who has apparently made something of a habit out of desecrating this exact altar whenever he passes through the area, though he hasn't shown up to do so in quite some time now. Tracking him down requires searching across several possible hideouts scattered throughout the wider reach, each one crawling with forsworn, who have no idea their territory has become collateral damage in an argument between two Daedric princes entirely unrelated to their own cause or grievances against the Nords. Logrolf himself seems entirely unaware of the danger awaiting his eventual return to that altar, still convinced somewhere in the back of his mind that his quiet desecrations have gone completely unnoticed all this time. A reward forged in cruelty. Successfully completing Molag Baal's twisted demands earns a uniquely brutal weapon called the Mace of Molag Baal, an artifact capable of simultaneously draining an enemy's health, stamina, and magicka in a single devastating strike, unlike almost anything else available anywhere in Skyrim. Few rewards in the entire game so perfectly mirror the personality of the entity who grants them. A weapon built entirely around domination and depletion, exactly the traits that define Molag Bal's twisted, possessive nature, as one of the oldest and cruelest Daedric princes still worshipped in secret across Tamriel. Wielding it afterward carries its own quiet weight, a constant physical reminder tucked into a weapon rack that whoever carries it once agreed, however reluctantly, to serve a prince who views mortals as little more than pieces on a very long, very patient game board. Something has been eating the dead. Markarth's own Hall of the Dead, the sacred mausoleum where the city buries its honored ancestors, suddenly closes its doors without warning, sparking confused outrage among Nord citizens desperate to visit their departed loved ones during the proper mourning season. The truth behind the closure proves far more disturbing than simple maintenance or renovation. Several of the dead have been discovered defiled, their flesh chewed away and their very bones snapped open to reach the marrow hidden inside, a discovery the priest in charge tries desperately and unsuccessfully to keep quiet from the grieving public. Families arriving to pay respects to their ancestors instead find only a locked door and a nervous excuse, an insult that only deepens the resentment already simmering between Markarth's Nord population and the outside authorities they blame for every inconvenience. A feast disguised as grief. Investigation eventually uncovers a secret society calling itself the Coven of Namira, a group of seemingly ordinary Markarth citizens, merchants, a dog seller, even a market vendor, who quietly gather to worship Namira, the Daedric Lady of Decay, through ritual cannibalism performed far from any public view or suspicion. That such an organized, patient conspiracy could operate for so long among people the entire city considers perfectly respectable neighbors speaks to exactly the kind of hidden rot Markarth seems to specialize in concealing beneath its most ordinary, familiar, everyday faces. The gathered members even maintain the outward appearance of an ordinary dinner party right up until the final ritual begins, sharing wine and idle gossip as though nothing at all separated them from any other quiet evening among friends in the city. The priestess, who was never grieving. At the center of the coven stands Iola, who initially appears to be nothing more than a troubled woman drawn toward dark practices out of desperation or grief over some unspoken personal loss she carries quietly. In reality, she serves as the coven's calculating leader, using seductive charm and quiet manipulation to draw new initiates, including unsuspecting priests of Archay, directly into Namira's twisted embrace, without them ever quite realizing what has happened. She proves herself far more dangerous and far more in control than her initial vulnerable appearance would ever suggest to a first-time visitor passing through the hall. Everything about her performance, the tremble in her voice, the careful choice of words, seems designed specifically to disarm suspicion in exactly the visitors most likely to otherwise recognize danger the moment they walk through the door. Watching for heresy in every shadow. While Namira's cult operates in secret beneath the city, Markarth's official religious tension plays out far more openly, embodied entirely by Ondalimar, the Thalmor Justicia personally stationed inside Understone Keep to enforce the empire-wide ban on Talus worship under the strict terms of the White Gold Concordat, signed after the Great War's end. His constant visible presence pacing near the Jarl's own throne room serves as a daily, unmistakable reminder to every citizen of Markarth exactly how thoroughly the Aldmeri Dominion's influence has embedded itself into the machinery of Nord governance, even in a city as fiercely independent-minded as this one has always proven itself to be. His two accompanying soldiers rarely leave his side, a visible show of force meant less for actual protection than for pure, deliberate intimidation, directed at anyone who might otherwise consider defying Thalmor authority openly. A heretic, hiding in plain sight. The deepest irony of Ondolamar's constant vigilance is that Rerek, the Jarl's own trusted steward and uncle, secretly continues worshipping Talos himself, hiding incriminating evidence of his devotion within his own private quarters mere steps away from the Justicia. He passes politely in the hallway every single day without ever once being suspected. It's a quiet, ongoing act of defiance hidden in plain sight, proof that even the Empire's most visible enforcement efforts in Markarth ultimately failed to reach into the private hearts of the very people they're supposedly watching most closely and most suspiciously of all. Every prayer Rerek offers behind closed doors becomes its own small act of rebellion, invisible to Ondolamar yet no less real, for going entirely unnoticed by the very Justicia sworn to stamp it out. Between an abandoned house hiding a Daedric prince and a mausoleum hiding a cannibal cult, it's easy to forget that most people in Markarth are simply trying to survive an ordinary day in an extraordinary dangerous city they call home. So let's step back out into its streets for a while and take in the smaller, quieter details that make this place feel genuinely lived in, rather than merely haunted by its own history. A river, running through everything. Markarth's defining physical feature isn't any single building or monument, but the Karth River itself, which cuts directly through the city's heart, spilling over carved stone waterfalls that thread between buildings, stairways, and bridges, rather than politely circling around them the way any ordinary town might expect its water to behave. Living here means learning to navigate a city where the sound of falling water is simply the permanent, unavoidable background noise of daily life, echoing off ancient Dwemer stone regardless of the hour or the season passing outside its many walls and archways. Long-time residents claim they can tell the time of year purely by the pitch and volume of the water rushing past their windows, louder and angrier during the spring thaw, softer and almost musical once winter finally sets back in over the mountains. Even visitors who stay only a single night often say the sound follows them long after they've left, a kind of permanent echo the City of Stone leaves behind in anyone who has ever actually slept within its walls. Soldiers sleeping in dwarven halls. Markarth's city guard doesn't bunk in any ordinary barracks built for the purpose. They're quartered directly inside a genuine Dwemer dormitory, carved thousands of years ago and repurposed beneath the looming guard tower that dominates the city's center from nearly every visible angle in town. Even the people sworn to protect Markarth's ordinary human residents spend their downtime surrounded by architecture built for a race that vanished from existence long before their own ancestors ever arrived in the Reach to claim any of it for their own use. It's a small, easily overlooked detail that nonetheless captures the entire spirit of the city in miniature, human authority quite literally sleeping inside the leftover shell of something far older and far less understood than themselves. The highest view in the city. Among Markarth's available homes for purchase, Vlindrel Hall stands apart both for its striking golden entrance door and for its position as the highest residence in the entire city, offering an unmatched view across the waterfalls, rooftops and mountains that define Markarth's dramatic, layered skyline from above. Like every other home here, it remains built entirely in the same Dwemer architectural style as everything else in the city, a reminder that even modern residents ultimately live inside someone else's ancient, borrowed design, no matter how much gold they eventually spend decorating its interior. Purchasing it requires more than coin alone. since the Jarl himself must first approve the sale. One more small reminder that even property ownership in Markarth runs through the same tangled web of favours and approval that governs practically everything else in the city. Where the city comes to talk, the Silverblood Inn functions as something considerably more important than a simple place to rent a room or grab a drink after a long day. It's the genuine social heart of Markarth, where travellers pick up bounty postings, arrange to hire mercenary companions, and occasionally settle personal disputes through an honest brawl rather than words alone. Given that the Silverbloods themselves own the establishment outright, even Markarth's most casual social gathering spot ultimately still funnels attention, gossip, and coin back toward the same powerful family that dominates everything else in the city's daily commerce and conversation. Every rumour traded over a mug of mead here, every hushed complaint about the mine or the guards, eventually finds its way back to ears that answer, directly or indirectly, to Thonar himself. A village caught in the same old fight. Not far from Markarth's own gates sits Karthweston, a small mining settlement led by a stubborn local landowner named Einathash, who finds himself locked in an escalating standoff against mercenaries sent directly by the Silverblood family to pressure him into selling Sanuarak mine entirely against his own will and better judgment. The confrontation plays out as a smaller, more personal echo of the exact same dynamic defining Markarth itself. Powerful money quietly squeezing independent reach communities until they either sell out or find some other way to survive the mounting pressure closing steadily in around them. Einathak's refusal to simply hand over his family's mine, even when facing armed mercenaries at his own doorstep, offers a small but stubborn counterpoint to the Silverbloods' usual pattern of intimidation, eventually working exactly as intended elsewhere in the Reach. A shrine of love in a city of blood. Amid all the violence, corruption, and quiet conspiracy defining Markarth's reputation across the Reach, the city still maintains an active temple of Dibella, overseen by a head priestess named Hamal, dedicated entirely to love, beauty, and human connection in a place that seems to have precious little practical use for any of it day to day. Its continued presence feels almost defiantly out of place here. A small, deliberately gentle institution surviving stubbornly inside a city whose most famous saying involves nothing but blood and silver, running endlessly through its ancient stone streets and gutters. Hamal and her fellow priestesses tend their shrine largely undisturbed by the political and religious storms raging elsewhere in the city. A small pocket of quiet devotion that neither the Silverbloods, the Forsworn, nor the Thalmor have ever seemed particularly interested in disrupting. Gold instead of silver. While silver dominates most conversations about Markarth's wealth, Kolskegger mine nearby actually produces something considerably rarer, gold, extracted under the ownership of a miner named Parvo Attius after being forcibly reclaimed from Forsworn occupation that had originally driven off his entire workforce. Its existence quietly complicates the popular image of the Reach as purely a silver-producing region, revealing an economy considerably more layered and more contested than the city's own famous saying might initially suggest to a passing traveller, unfamiliar with the wider valley and its many hidden resources. Parvo himself seems keenly aware of how precarious his claim really is, having already watched Forsworn raiders overrun the mine once before, and he keeps a wary eye on the surrounding hills every single day he spends working it. A crypt with a second purpose. Reachcliff Cave serves double duty within the wider Reach, functioning as both an ancient Draugr-infested burial site worth exploring for its own dangers and treasures, and, far more disturbingly, as the secret secondary meeting hall used by the Coven of Namira for their most elaborate cannibalistic rituals away from prying eyes. That a single cave can hold both ancient Nordic dead and a modern conspiracy of the living, feeding on the more recently deceased, says something quietly unsettling about how thoroughly the Reach recycles its own dark history for whatever new horror happens to come wandering along next. Poverty wearing. Familiar faces. Life in the Warrens isn't an abstract statistic tucked away in some report nobody reads. It belongs to specific named residents like Kereen, Degain and Garve, beggars whose daily existence unfolds in visible, undeniable contrast. Just a short walk from the wealth and comfort enjoyed on Markarth's dry side every single day of the year. Encountering them by name rather than as generic background scenery forces a kind of honesty about the city's inequality that statistics alone could never quite capture on their own, no matter how carefully those numbers might have been compiled by some distant imperial clerk. Each one carries a small, personal story of misfortune that led them here, reminders that the gap between Dryside comfort and Warren's poverty was rarely accidental, and rarely as far removed from ordinary bad luck as Markarth's wealthier residents like to believe. Armour shaped by the mountain itself. Markarth's city guards wear a visibly distinct style of armour compared to their counterparts patrolling other holds across Skyrim. One clearly influenced by the same Dwemer aesthetic surrounding them on every wall and archway throughout the city. They've personally sworn to protect and defend. Even law enforcement here can't fully escape the architectural inheritance shaping absolutely everything else about daily life in Markarth, right down to the very metal covering a guard's shoulders as they patrol the waterfalls each night on their rounds through the mist. It's a small, almost subconscious detail that most travelers never consciously register, yet it quietly reinforces the same lesson repeated everywhere else in the city, that nothing here truly belongs to the humans who currently claim it, only borrowed for however long the mountain allows. Every stone street and every named beggar tells you something true about how Markarth actually works day to day, season after season, generation after generation. But every city this old accumulates a different kind of history too. The strange, half-remembered kind that lives mostly in trivia, glitches, and the odd detail nobody quite planned, but everyone eventually noticed anyway over the years. A city that refuses to disappear. Few locations across the entire Elder Scrolls series enjoy the kind of consistent, repeated appearances Markarth has received over the decades, showing up first as Markarth's side in the original arena, later as the fully realized City of Stone in Skyrim, and again as a bustling Reachfolk capital in the online multiplayer world of Elder Scrolls Online years afterward. That kind of persistence across multiple games spanning literal decades of development suggests the developers themselves recognize something uniquely compelling about this particular corner of Tamriel worth revisiting again and again across successive generations of players. Few other named cities in the entire series can claim such a consistent, unbroken thread of appearances, a testament to just how much creative potential a single mountain city carved from Dwemer stone apparently continues to offer writers decades after its first digital appearance. A city alive centuries earlier, the Elder Scrolls Online version of Markarth depicts the city centuries before the events of Skyrim ever take place, ruled by an Ard named Kadach, and populated by a thriving, functioning Reachfolk society, rather than the occupied, contested territory players later encounter under strict Nord control. Seeing the city governed entirely by its own native people, rather than fought over endlessly by outside powers, offers a genuinely rare glimpse of what Markarth might have continued to look like had history simply taken a different, less violent turn somewhere along the way through the centuries. Walking those same stone streets centuries earlier, filled with thriving reachfolk markets and open worship rather than gnawed guards and Thalmor suspicion, makes the eventual fate of the city under Skyrim's timeline feel considerably more tragic in hindsight than it otherwise might. Players who explore both versions back-to-back often describe a strange melancholy feeling, watching a living self-governed community slowly give way century by century to the occupied, contested Markarth everyone eventually comes to know so well. Dungeon music in a royal palace. Despite technically functioning as a proper royal palace and seat of governmental power for the entire Reach, Understone Keep plays dungeon-style background music rather than the warmer, more welcoming city themes heard inside every other Jarl's Hall across the whole of Skyrim without exception. Whether an intentional artistic choice meant to reinforce the Keep's oppressive, ancient Dwemer atmosphere, or simply an overlooked technical oversight during development, the effect leaves a lasting subconscious impression that something here never quite stopped feeling like a tomb rather than a proper home for the living. Visitors who can't quite articulate why Understone Keep unsettles them more than any other Jarl's Hall in Skyrim may simply be responding, without realizing it, to a soundtrack quietly working against them the entire time. The farthest point west, according to the game's own internal map data, Markarth holds the distinction of being the single westernmost named location across the entire province of Skyrim, planted right at the province's furthest edge against the neighbouring border of high rock beyond. It's a small, mostly trivial piece of geographic information, yet it reinforces the sense that Markarth exists at the literal margins of civilized Skyrim, as far removed from the traditional Nord heartland as any settlement in the game can physically reach without actually crossing into another province entirely. Standing at the city gates and looking west, a traveller is technically looking toward the very edge of the map itself, a fitting final detail for a city that has always positioned itself somewhere between two worlds, rather than fully inside either one. A siege that never happened. Early development plans for Skyrim's Civil War questline reportedly once included a full-scale siege sequence for Markarth, similar in structure and dramatic weight to the well-known Battle for Whiterun that ultimately made it into the finished game instead, complete with its own planned throne room confrontation once the city fell. Traces of that abandoned concept still linger in unused dialogue discovered by dedicated players poring over the game's files years after its original release, hinting at a much larger, more explosive Stormcloak campaign for the Reach that never quite made it past the drawing board before launch day arrived. Whether the cut was a matter of development time, engine limitations, or a simple decision that the political fallout mattered more than another siege sequence, the Markarth player's actually experience arrives already conquered. Its most dramatic possible battle left forever unfought in the shipped game. Doors that remember what was cut. Scattered throughout Understone Keep, players occasionally encounter permanently locked doors and strangely unreachable ledges that seem to serve no functional purpose within the finished game at all. Small architectural leftovers hinting at additional rooms, quests, or content planned during development, but ultimately cut before the game's release date. These quiet dead ends function almost like fossils, physical evidence of a larger, more ambitious version of Markarth that once existed only in the minds of its original designers before budget and time inevitably intervened on their plans. dedicated explorers who make a habit of testing every door in the keep eventually learn to recognize these dead ends by feel, small architectural ghosts of a Markarth that almost was but never quite made it into the final release. A guard who falls from the sky. Even years after release, players still occasionally report a bizarre, persistent glitch in which fast traveling directly to Understone Keep causes a random city guard to suddenly launch straight into the air and plummet to their death for no discernible reason whatsoever. It remains one of Skyrim's stranger, more inexplicable bugs, a small, darkly comedic reminder that even a city this carefully detailed and lore-rich still occasionally succumbs to the same unpredictable physics chaos haunting nearly every corner of the game's aging, creaking engine. No two players seem to agree on exactly what triggers it, only that it happens often enough for the community to have quietly accepted it as one of Markarth's odder, less lore-friendly traditions. A fortune hidden behind a pillar, tucked away in the Jarl's own private quarters within Understone Keep, sits a genuinely easy-to-miss secret. A hidden stash, accessible only by carefully edging around a support pillar near the bedroom, revealing a chest, several coin purses, and valuable ingots that most visitors, and even many long-time veteran players, walk right past without ever noticing at all. It stands as a small, satisfying reward for anyone curious enough to actually explore every inch of a room, rather than simply passing through it on the way to more obvious business waiting elsewhere in the keep. Even the Jarl himself, so consumed with the daily business of governing a restless hold, seems entirely unaware that a small fortune sits quietly stashed just a few careful steps from his own sleeping quarters. 2 books, 2 truths. Markarth's library of in-universe texts includes both The Bear of Markarth, an account sympathetic to Ulfric Stormcloak's actions during the Markarth incident, and The City of Stone, a mercenary's more grounded, skeptical account of the exact same violent history told from a very different, more cynical angle entirely. Reading both side by side, rather than trusting either one alone, reveals exactly how contested and unreliable Markarth's own written history remains. A city where even the official record refuses to agree on who the real villains actually were that terrible day. Scholars travelling through the Reach have noted that which book a local citizen chooses to keep on their shelf often says more about their politics and their ancestry than any direct question ever could. A quiet, silent form of allegiance hidden inside something as innocent as a bookshelf. Neither text claims to be entirely objective, and neither one probably is, leaving any careful reader to assemble their own version of the truth somewhere in the gap between the two competing accounts. The saying that outlasts every ruler. No matter which faction ultimately claims Markarth, whether Imperial or Stormcloak, whether the forsworn conspiracy gets exposed or quietly buried again, whether Madanach lives or dies in that tunnel beneath the mountain, one single truth about this city never changes across any version of its long and violent story. Blood and silver are what flows through Markarth, exactly as it always has, and exactly as it almost certainly always will, long after every ruler, every conqueror, and every quiet conspiracy currently shaping its streets has faded into just another chapter, carved somewhere into its endless, patient stone, waiting for the next weary traveler to stumble across it in their turn. Empires rise and fall, Jarls come and go, and forsworn kings live or die in mine tunnels below. Yet somehow the waterfalls keep falling, the silver keeps flowing, and the city keeps standing exactly where the Dwemer first raised it, patient and indifferent to whoever happens to be ruling it this particular century.